So students, from what we have done, it has become quite clear that Aristotle's Poetics is a lopsided work and most of it is devoted to the consideration of tragedy in all its aspects and constituent parts. We have done in our introduction part that Aristotle's Poetics is divided into various chapters, and from chapter 6th to 22nd, almost 17 of them are devoted exclusively to a discussion of tragedy, and these chapters form the main body of the whole work. Thus, it becomes clear that poetics is a work which is chiefly concerned with tragedy and which is regarded as the highest poetic form. But the theory of tragedy is worked out with such insight and comprehension that it becomes the type of the theory of literature. But before we proceed to consider Aristotle's conception of tragedy, it must be constantly borne in mind that the Greek conception of tragedy was quite different from the modern conception. Today, we regard tragedy as a story with an unhappy ending, but this was not so with Greek conception. In Greek language, the word tragedy meant a goat song, and the word came to be used for the dramas because of the practice of awarding goats to the winners in a dramatic contest. On the days of the dramatic festivals, 4 plays were performed, and out of these 4 plays, 3 of them were generally serious in tone, and one was based on satire. So, the Greek tragedies were serious in tone, but many of them had happy endings. The Greek conception of tragedy should be kept in mind, for Aristotle did not consider tragedy from the modern point of view. It should also be borne in mind that Aristotle was not familiar with modern drama, and his views are based entirely on the Greek drama with which he was familiar. Coming to the point that what is the function of tragedy? Aristotle defines tragedy as the imitation of an action which should be serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude in a language beautified in different parts with different kinds of embellishments through action and not narration, and through scenes of pity and fear, bringing about the catharsis of these emotions. Now, this definition has wide implications. It falls naturally into 2 parts. The first part forms that imitation of an action and not narration, and the second part is concerned with the function and emotional effects of tragedy. So, to do the function of tragedy, we will first of all consider as to what is the main concern. The main function is to give pleasure. So he says pleasure is the main concern of tragedy. He says that there are various sources of pleasure. Natural sense of harmony and rhythm is the first one among them. He says tragedy gives pleasure which is common to all poetry. According to Aristotle, the function of poetry is to give a refined pleasure, and for this purpose, he says the sources of tragic pleasures may be listed as follows. The pleasure is derived partly from our natural instinct and sense of harmony and rhythm. Verse and rhyme are not necessary, but they certainly enhance the pleasure of poetry. Second is, it is also derived partly from the instinct of imitation. It means that pleasure arising from seeing a thing or action well imitated. A successful tragedy gives pleasure because it satisfies our basic instinct of imitation. Poetry is imitation, and imitation of something with which we are not familiar increases our knowledge, and to know, to learn is pleasure. But these two sources of pleasure are common to all poetry. What is the distinctive pleasure of tragedy? The answer is that the peculiar pleasure of tragedy is caused by the catharsis of emotions of pity and fear. Means that Greek philosopher distinguishes between pure pleasure arising from the exercise of some function of human faculty, as the exercise of judgment, perception, etc., and second, incidental pleasure, which arises from getting rid of some pain or fault or correcting some wrong. So, tragedy gives incidental pleasure as it directs and controls the emotion. It guides our emotions to goals considered right and proper by the wise and good, and hence gives pleasure. So, it corrects our emotional responses. It frees the individual from anxiety, worry, etc. Tragedy gives pure pleasure as well. It imitates action and life, its pain and misery. And this imitation, if it is well done, it is gripping and absorbing. There is a total emotional identification of the spectator with the person who suffers on the stage. Peripety and anagnoses are commanded by Aristotle because they heighten the seductive power, the gripping interest of the action. Pure pleasure results from the exercise of our emotions, senses, and thoughts on the tragic action. In this way, we smile through our tears. Coming to the next point, Aristotle says tragedy gives pleasure because it results in enhanced understanding of life and its problems. It provides a kind of inner illumination. The unity of plot, the diction, and the spectator, etc., are other sources of pleasure in tragedy. Coming to the conclusion, we may say that such are the main features of Aristotle's theory of tragedy. The theory might have its weaknesses Aristotle knew only Greek tragedy, and his conclusions are based entirely on the drama with which he was familiar, and hence often his views are not of universal application. But despite of all that can be said against it, Aristotle's theory of tragedy is the foundation on which all subsequent discussion of literary aesthetics has most securely based itself. Aristotle's views might have been challenged, but their history is the history of tragedy.